The evening draped the small town in a familiar stillness. The wind rustled through the branches of ancient oaks lining the streets, their leaves whispering secrets to the night. Streetlights flickered faintly, casting golden pools on the uneven cobblestones below. In a modest apartment perched on the edge of town, Clara sat at her kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. The tea inside had gone cold an hour ago, but she hadn't noticed. Her eyes were locked on the phone resting silently before her, its screen dark and unyielding. She didn't dare pick it up, not yet. Her mind was a storm of swirling thoughts, each one heavier and more jagged than the last. Clara had been married to Daniel for 6 years, and she loved him with a quiet, steady devotion. He was the kind of man who could make her laugh even on her worst days, whose warm brown eyes had once felt like home. But lately, something had shifted, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. He'd started coming home later, blaming it on endless paperwork or last-minute meetings. His answers to her questions about his day grew shorter, his gaze skittering away when she pressed for details. The playful banter that used to fill their evenings had dwindled, replaced by a strained silence that hung between them like a fog. She wasn't one for drama. Clara had never rifled through his pockets or scrolled through his phone while he slept. She prided herself on her trust, her calm rationality. But now, doubt crept in like ivy, wrapping tendrils around her peace of mind. What if he's cheating? The thought struck her one rainy evening as she sat alone, the clock ticking past 10 while Daniel's voice crackled through the phone with yet another excuse, got held up with a report. Don't wait up. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words looping in her head until they felt like a truth she couldn't unsee. For days, she wrestled with it. She tried to dismiss it. Daniel wasn't the type, was he? But the seed of suspicion had taken root, and it grew with every late night, every dodged glance. By the end of the week, Clara knew she couldn't sit still any longer. She needed to act. Not with confrontation. She couldn't bear the thought of accusing him and being wrong, of seeing hurt flash across his face over nothing. No, she needed something quieter, smarter. A test. And for that, she needed an ally. The next morning, she dialed Rachel. They'd been friends since high school, bonded by shared secrets and late-night talks under the stars. Life had pulled them in different directions, Rachel with her chaotic freelancing gigs, Clara with her steady office job, but their connection held firm. Rachel was everything Clara wasn't. Brash, fearless, the kind of woman who'd once dyed her hair purple on a dare and laughed when it turned out patchy. If anyone could help her pull this off, it was Rachel. They met in Clara's kitchen that afternoon, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the faint tang of lemon cleaner. Rachel sprawled in a chair, her boots propped on the edge of the table until Clara shot her a look. She grinned and dropped them to the floor. So, what's this emergency? Rachel asked, blowing on her steaming mug. You sounded like someone died when you called. Clara took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around her spoon as she stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. It's Daniel, she said finally. I think he might be hiding something. I need to know if he's faithful. Rachel's eyebrows shot up, and she set her mug down with a soft clink. Whoa, hold up. You think he's stepping out on you? Mr. Perfect Daniel? I don't know, Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. That's the problem. He's been different late nights, vague answers. I need to be sure. Rachel leaned back, crossing her arms. Okay, so what's the plan? You want me to follow him around with binoculars? Maybe hire a PI with a trench coat. Clara shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite herself. No, nothing that drastic. I was thinking, maybe you could go on a date with him. Rachel choked on her coffee, coughing as she waved a hand. Excuse me? You want me to date your husband? Not as you, Clara clarified quickly. As someone else. I'd tell him you're a friend or something, someone I know who's in town. You could meet him, see how he acts. If he flirts, I don't know, crosses a line. Rachel stared at her, then burst into laughter. Clara, this is insane. You've been watching too many spy movies. What if he figures out who I am? He won't, Clara said firmly. You've never met him. I've never shown him your pictures, never even mentioned your name much. To him, you'd just be a stranger. Please, Rachel. I can't do this alone. Rachel sobered, studying her friend's face. The laughter faded, replaced by a flicker of concern. She could see the strain in Clara's eyes, the quiet panic lurking beneath her calm exterior. After a long pause, she sighed. All right, fine. But if this blows up in our faces, you're buying me a case of wine. Expensive stuff, too, not that cheap boxed crap. Clara exhaled, a wave of relief washing over her. Deal. They spent the next hour plotting. Clara crafted a cover story. Rachel would be Sophie, a vague acquaintance from out of town who needed a friendly face to show her around. She'd pitch it to Daniel as a favor, nothing suspicious. Rachel brainstormed her approach, how she'd dress, what she'd say to test him without pushing too far. They agreed on subtlety, a few light compliments, a casual touch of flirtation, just enough to see if Daniel took the bait. As they talked, Clara's nerves twisted tighter. What if he failed the test? What if he passed, but found out later and hated her for it? But the uncertainty was worse than the risk. She needed to know, and Rachel was her lifeline. The plan took shape over the next week. Clara fed Daniel the story on a Tuesday evening, keeping her tone light as they washed dishes together. Oh, by the way, she said, scrubbing a plate, there's this woman I know, Sophie. She's visiting from out of town and doesn't know anyone here. I thought maybe you could take her to coffee or something. I feel bad leaving her alone. Daniel paused, a soapy sponge in his hand, and frowned. Sophie? Who's that? Just someone I met through work a while back, Clara lied smoothly. She's nice, but shy. It's not a big deal, just an hour or so. He shrugged, clearly puzzled but not resistant. Sure, I guess. If it's important to you. When? Friday evening? Maybe that cafe on Main Street? Clara suggested, her heart thudding. All right, he said, turning back to the sink. But you owe me one. Clara forced a laugh, hiding the tremor in her hands as she dried a glass. Rachel, meanwhile, threw herself into the role with gusto. On Friday afternoon, she stood before her mirror, transforming into Sophie. She picked a deep green dress, elegant but not over the top, and pinned her hair into a loose bun, a stark contrast to her usual wild curls. A swipe of mascara, a dab of lipstick, and a pair of borrowed glasses completed the look. She studied herself, satisfied. No way Daniel would connect her to Clara's unseen best friend. Clara texted her last-minute advice, don't be too forward, but don't let him off easy either. See if he bites? Rachel replied with a thumbs-up emoji and headed out. The cafe was a quaint little place, its walls lined with mismatched bookshelves and fairy lights strung across the ceiling. Rachel arrived early, claiming a corner table with a clear view of the door. She clutched a menu, pretending to read it as her pulse quickened. At exactly 7 o'clock, Daniel walked in, scanning the room. He wore a navy button-up and jeans, his dark hair slightly tousled from the wind. Spotting her, he approached with a hesitant smile. You must be Daniel, Rachel said, standing to offer her hand. I'm Sophie. Clara's told me so much about you. He shook her hand, his grip firm but quick. Yeah, I'm Daniel. Nice to meet you. Honestly, I'm not sure why Clara was so set on this, but here I am. Rachel grinned, settling back into her seat. She's sweet like that, always looking out for people. Shall we order? The conversation flowed easily at first. They chatted about the town's quirks, the old clock tower that chimed off key, the bakery with the best scones. Rachel tested the waters. Clara didn't mention you were so funny, she said with a laugh after one of his dry remarks. Then, leaning forward slightly, you clean up pretty well, too. Daniel chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Thanks, I guess. I don't get out much, work keeps me busy. He wasn't shutting her down, but he wasn't biting either. Rachel pressed a little harder, her tone playful. Oh, come on, A guy like you? I bet you've got plenty of stories. He shrugged, sipping his coffee. Not really. Just the usual stuff. For 30 minutes, it went like that, pleasant but guarded. Rachel started to think Clara's fears were baseless. Then the door swung open, and a tall woman in a crisp blazer marched in. She zeroed in on their table, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Daniel's face brightened, and he stood abruptly. "Oh, Julia," he said, his voice lifting. "Perfect timing. Sophie, meet my wife, Julia." Rachel's mind screeched to a halt. "Wife?" She gaped at the woman, who offered a polite smile and a handshake. "Hi, Sophie," Julia said, her tone smooth as silk. "Sorry to crash your chat, but Daniel and I have some urgent family stuff to deal with." Rachel managed a nod, her thoughts a jumbled mess. Daniel jumped in, his words rushed. "Yeah, sorry, Sophie. Clara didn't mention we had plans tonight. Hope you're not upset. Julia, let's go, we're late." They left in a flurry of apologies, leaving Rachel staring at her coffee. He called her his wife? But Clara's his wife. Her head spun. Julia had been too poised, Daniel too eager to bolt. Was this a setup? A mistress covering as a spouse? She needed to tell Clara, now. Rachel didn't waste time. She called Clara from the cafe parking lot, her voice low and urgent. "Meet me at your place." "You won't believe this." By 8:30, they were huddled on Clara's couch, a bottle of untouched wine between them. Rachel recounted every moment, the small talk, the subtle tests, Julia's entrance. Clara's face drained of color, her hands twisting in her lap. "He brought another woman and called her his wife," she whispered, her voice cracking. "So it's true? He's been lying to me." Rachel grabbed her arm. "Wait, Clara, don't spiral. It was weird, but he didn't flirt with me, not once. Maybe there's more to it." "What do you want to do?" Clara's eyes hardened. "Revenge. If he's playing me, I'll make him pay. Something big." They spent hours plotting. Clara's ideas grew wilder. Public humiliation, a fake lover to throw in his face. Rachel tried to rein her in, suggesting they dig deeper first, but Clara's anger drowned out reason. She paced the living room, her voice rising with each plan, until exhaustion forced them to call it a night. The next day flipped everything upside down. Daniel came home at 5 o'clock, earlier than usual, whistling as he dropped his keys on the counter. He hugged Clara from behind as she chopped vegetables, oblivious to her stiffness. "You won't believe yesterday," he said, chuckling. "That Sophie you set me up with? I knew something was off. I don't do random coffee dates, you know me. So I called Julia, my coworker. Told her to come play my wife and get me out of there. Worked like a charm. She swooped in, and Sophie didn't blink." Clara froze, the knife hovering over a carrot. Daniel rambled on, laughing about how he and Julia had joked about it at work. He had no clue Sophie was Rachel, no hint of the test. "So, you didn't flirt with her?" Clara asked, barely breathing. "Flirt?" Daniel stepped back, bewildered. "Why would I? I thought you'd get a kick out of this. Did you think I'd actually?" Clara laughed, a shaky, relieved sound, and he joined in, oblivious to her racing pulse. He hadn't cheated. He'd dodged the trap. But confessing the truth? She couldn't. It stayed locked between her and Rachel. Sunday morning, Clara met Rachel at the park. They sat on a weathered bench, the air crisp with spring. Clara relayed Daniel's story, and Rachel howled with laughter. "He outfoxed us," she gasped. "We're awful at this." Clara smiled, but it faded fast. "I feel like an idiot, Rachel. I almost broke us over nothing." "He doesn't know," Rachel said firmly. "You got your proof. He's solid. Let it go." They watched kids chase pigeons, the absurdity sinking in. Clara's guilt lingered, but she swore off tests for good. Daniel teased her about Sophie for days, never suspecting the truth. Some secrets, she decided, were better kept. The wind carried a faint chill as it swept across the park, tugging at Clara's scarf and rustling the leaves scattered across the grass. She pulled her coat tighter, her gaze drifting to the horizon where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. Rachel sat beside her, still catching her breath from laughing, her cheeks flushed from the cold and the absurdity of it all. For a moment, they let the silence settle, the weight of the past week hanging unspoken between them. Clara's relief was real, but it came with a bitter aftertaste. She'd been so sure, so ready to believe the worst of Daniel, that she'd nearly unraveled everything herself. The test had proven his loyalty, yes, but it also exposed her own fragility. The cracks in her trust she hadn't known were there. She shifted on the bench, her fingers tracing the worn wood, and glanced at Rachel. "Do you think I'm crazy?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with something raw. "For doubting him like that?" Rachel tilted her head, her expression softening. "Crazy? Nah. Human, maybe. You saw smoke and went looking for fire. Most people would have done the same. But I didn't have to," Clara countered, her brow furrowing. "I could have just asked him. Talked to him. Instead, I dragged you into this mess." Rachel snorted, nudging her with an elbow. "Please. I live for messes. And honestly, it was kind of fun, playing Sophie, watching him squirm. I'd do it again if you asked." Clara managed a small laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I won't. Ever. I'm done with games." "Good," Rachel said, stretching her arms above her head. "Because next time, I'm charging you double for the acting gig." They fell quiet again, the park emptying out as families trickled home and the shadows lengthened. Clara's thoughts churned. Daniel's innocence was a balm, but it didn't erase the sting of her own actions. She'd lied to him, schemed behind his back, and even now, as he hummed in their kitchen oblivious to it all, she carried the secret like a stone in her chest. Could she live with that? Could she let it fade, or would it fester? Rachel seemed to sense her shift in mood. She dropped her playful tone, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees. "Look, Clara, you're beating yourself up over this, but you don't have to. He's fine. You're fine. Nobody got hurt." "Yet," Clara murmured. "What if he finds out? What if he looks at me one day and sees I didn't trust him?" "Then you deal with it," Rachel said simply. "You tell him the truth, and you figure it out together. But right now, he's not asking. So don't borrow trouble." Clara nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. Rachel was right. Daniel wasn't suspicious. He'd turned the whole thing into a funny story, a quirky footnote in their life. Maybe she could leave it there too. Maybe. Back home, the apartment smelled of garlic and rosemary. Daniel stood at the stove, stirring a pot of pasta sauce, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He grinned when Clara walked in, kicking off her boots by the door. "There you are," he said, waving the wooden spoon like a baton. "Thought I'd have to eat all this myself. How's Rachel?" Clara hesitated, her coat halfway off. "She's good," she said, forcing a smile. "Same old Rachel." "Glad someone's keeping you entertained while I'm slaving away in here," he teased, turning back to the stove. "You owe me a taste test, by the way. This sauce is a masterpiece." She crossed the room, peering into the pot. The rich, red sauce bubbled gently, and she inhaled its warmth, letting it ground her. "Smells amazing," she said, and meant it. She grabbed a spoon, dipping it in for a taste, and Daniel watched her with mock seriousness. "Verdict?" "Perfect," she said, and this time her smile felt real. For a moment, it was just them, the easy rhythm of their life before doubt had crept in. She wanted to hold on to it, to push the rest away. But later, as they ate across from each other at the small table, the quiet returned. Not the strained silence of before, but something softer, more fragile. Daniel chatted about work, a new project, a coworker's bad jokes, but Clara's mind wandered. She studied him, the way his hands moved when he talked, the crinkle at the corners of his eyes when he laughed. She loved him, God, she did, but the shadow of her own mistrust lingered, a ghost she couldn't quite banish. "Clara," Daniel's voice cut through her thoughts. He was looking at her, his fork paused midair. "You okay? You're a million miles away." She blinked, startled. "Yeah, sorry. Just tired, I guess." He reached across the table, squeezing her hand. Rough week, huh? Well, you've got me now. No more weird coffee dates with strangers. Her stomach twisted, but she squeezed his hand back. Good, she said, her voice steady. I'd rather keep you to myself. He grinned, oblivious, and went back to his food. Clara watched him, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't tell him, not yet, maybe not ever. But she'd make it right in other ways. She'd rebuild what she'd almost broken, piece by piece. Days turned into weeks, and life settled into a tentative normalcy. Daniel's late nights tapered off. He'd switched projects at work, he said, something less demanding. Clara threw herself into her routine, taking on extra tasks at the office, cooking elaborate dinners, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind quiet. She and Rachel still met up, but the Sophie incident became an unspoken pact, mentioned only in passing, with a wry smile or a quick eye roll. Yet something lingered beneath the surface. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she'd dodged a bullet, not just with Daniel's fidelity, but with something bigger, something she couldn't name. It gnawed at her during quiet moments on the bus ride home, in the shower, as she lay awake beside Daniel's steady breathing. Was it guilt? Fear? Or had she glimpsed a truth about herself she wasn't ready to face? One rainy afternoon, she found herself alone in the apartment, the patter of drops against the windows a soft drumbeat. She wandered to the bookshelf, pulling out an old photo album she hadn't touched in years. Flipping through it, she saw snapshots of her and Daniel, their wedding, a road trip to the coast, a blurry selfie from their first apartment. Smiles frozen in time, moments she'd once thought unbreakable. Then she stopped on a photo from their third anniversary. They were at a lake, Daniel's arm around her, both of them laughing as the wind whipped her hair across her face. She remembered that day, how he'd surprised her with a picnic, how they'd talked about kids and a house someday. She'd felt so sure of him then, so safe. Her throat tightened. When had that certainty slipped away? Was it his late nights, or had it started earlier, in the slow drift of years? She closed the album, pressing her fingers to her eyes. She didn't want to lose him, not to another woman, not to her own doubts. The front door clicked open, startling her. Daniel stepped in, shaking rain from his jacket, a grocery bag dangling from his hand. Brought reinforcements, he said, holding up the bag. Thought we could make those cookies you like. You know, the ones with the ridiculous amount of chocolate. Clara laughed, the sound breaking through her haze. You're a saint. Tell that to my dentist, he quipped, kicking off his shoes. They moved to the kitchen together, measuring flour and cracking eggs, the space filling with chatter and the clatter of bowls. Rain streaked the windows, but inside, it was warm, alive. Clara caught herself watching him again, his easy grin, the way he licked dough off his thumb, and felt a pang of gratitude so sharp it hurt. She wouldn't test him again. She'd trust him, not because she had proof, but because she chose to. And if the doubts came back, when they came back, she'd face them head-on, with words, not schemes. As the oven hummed and the scent of chocolate drifted through the air, Clara leaned against the counter, watching Daniel wrestle with a stubborn cookie sheet. This was enough, she told herself. This was worth keeping. But secrets have a way of surfacing, even when buried deep. A month later, Rachel called Clara late at night, her voice tight with something Clara couldn't place. Turn on the news, Rachel said without preamble. Now. Clara fumbled for the remote, her heart thudding. The screen flickered to life, a local anchor's voice filling the room. Breaking story out of downtown. Authorities have arrested a woman identified as Julia Grayson, a project manager at Technova, on charges of corporate espionage. Sources say Grayson was involved in a scheme to sell proprietary data to overseas buyers. More details to follow as this story develops. Clara's breath caught. Julia Grayson. Daniel's coworker, the wife from the cafe. She turned to Daniel, who'd walked in from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes. What's going on? He asked, frowning at the TV. Clara stared at him, then back at the screen. That's Julia, she said, her voice trembling. You're Julia. Daniel's face went slack. What? Espionage? That's insane. She's just a manager. I mean, she's intense, but... He trailed off, realization dawning. Clara's mind raced. Julia had been more than a convenient alibi that night. Had Daniel known something? Had he been involved? Clara, he said, stepping closer, his hands raised. I swear, I had no idea. She just helped me out that night, I didn't. Stop, Clara cut him off, her voice sharp. Just stop. The room spun. The test she'd set had been a game, a controlled risk. But this was real, and it was spiraling beyond her grasp. She sank onto the couch, the news droning on, and wondered how deep the betrayal ran, not just Daniel's, but her own. The stillness of the small town shattered that night, and Clara knew nothing would be the same.